Brian, you may want to put it in a presentation mode if you want. Hi all, thanks a lot for joining in on time. Let us give a minute for others to join. They are all joining as we speak now. Hi all, good evening and warm welcome to the webinar. This is yet another webinar that is arranged by PMI Ireland chapter and is sponsored by EY. My name is Santosh Joshi. I will be your host today. This webinar is being recorded for the future reference. While going through the webinar, if you have any questions, please feel free to use a chat session to ask your questions. We'll be picking up the questions and presenting it to the speaker to answer all your queries. Today's webinar is mainly about the eMobility. What challenges the project managers face while executing the eMobility programs. A key takeaway for you while you attend this webinar is to keep in mind what are the lessons that you can learn that you can apply in your real projects when you get an opportunity to execute e-mobility projects. And that is the key takeaway that you can keep in mind. And while you are attending, if you have any questions, again, please feel free to enter your questions on the chat box. We have an eminent speaker with us today to walk us through the real life challenges in implementing e-mobility projects. I would like to welcome Yuvraj to introduce the speaker to you all. Yuvraj is a volunteer for the PMI Ireland chapter in the event management group. Yuvraj, it is my pleasure to welcome you. Please introduce the speaker.
Thanks, Santosh. Absolutely, it's my pleasure, to welcome Brian for the session today. So, a quick introduction about Brian for the webinar. So thank you everyone for joining in for the webinar today. So Brian is based in US and is a member of EY's eMobility team, and he has more than 15 years of experience in strategic planning, digital solution development, and data science across the energy and utility sector. He has served as an advisor for the several utility industry institutes and associations. Recently, Brian has led the development of a statewide EV infra plans in the US, focusing on market assessment, utility engagement, and implementation strategies. So, thank you, Brian, for joining us today, and over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me. Right. So first off here, I just kind of want to start out by giving us a little bit of background about kind of where I come from and what my team at EY does and how it relates to electric mobility. I'm a part of a global interdisciplinary team that pulls together colleagues across the entire ecosystem for electric mobility, ranging from mining and minerals, manufacturing with automakers, power and utilities, corporate strategy and planning, finance and tax, and government and public sector administration. And so it's that combination of teams that really is what enables us to deliver and help clients with their e-mobility objectives. And that's something that, as you're approaching an electric mobility project, to keep that in mind. It's going to take a very diverse set of members of your projects to successfully implement those engagements. One thing else I just want to highlight here, there's a report that my colleagues here at EY helped contribute to for Euroelectric. I'll drop a link to it here in the chat. It's a free report. It contains a lot of market research information about electric mobility in Europe. It goes into a lot of kind of detailed discussions about different aspects of electric mobility, capabilities of technology, program designs, all of that kind of stuff. So it's a much deeper discussion about where the market's going, and what are the kind of challenges and opportunities for electric mobility. So as I mentioned, electric mobility projects are very complex and diverse projects in most cases. A fleet electrification project usually has aspects that address asset management of the vehicles themselves, whether it's replacing vehicles or acquiring new vehicles. There's aspects of designing business processes and implementation of new processes for the electric vehicles that are being adopted. There's training for the drivers or people that are maintaining those vehicles. There's engagement with utilities to make sure you have the electricity to charge those vehicles and maintain them. Then there's also all the financial side of it, because there's an investment being made in those assets, and depending on your organization's objectives, there may be some financial returns from those investments compared to an internal combustion engine vehicle that would like to be part of the monitoring and tracking of the program. Additionally, there's infrastructure development, updates to existing parking structures or buildings, integrating in electric vehicle chargers, places to store and maintain the vehicles, batteries, all of that comes into play as well. And then not to mention the fact that then there's new service agreements and other legal instruments that are part of maintaining an electric vehicle fleet. So there's a whole wide range of things that come into play. When it comes down to kind of how EY looks at the fleet electrification journey for our clients, I break things down here into kind of 4 key stages. The first part being where you're going through an assessment. And the purple text here above is something that's probably more familiar to everyone here at PMI. That first kind of assessment phase, there's a lot of analysis going on. That's sort of the initiation phase of a project. Then we move into a planning phase, sort of developing the more tactical implementation for what's going to happen, which vehicles are going to be switched out, when, how the process is going to be changed, what the contracts are, what the procurements are. Then moving into deployment and scaling. The deployment and scaling part is really sort of executing and then monitoring, controlling within the PMI lexicon of terms for project management. That's where you're going through and deploying vehicles. In a lot of cases, these aren't a one-time project to implement and electrify every vehicle. A lot of companies start with a portion of their fleet and will electrify a handful up to 10, 15 vehicles at a time to do some initial development, figure out how things work, take those learnings, and then develop an initial task to then scale up and further grow that fleet of electric vehicles. And then finally, there's the kind of the closing process of that, which is sort of wrapping things up into kind of more of a ongoing operational phase of managing electric vehicles. When it comes to the approach to running a project for fleet electrification, you can approach it as a standalone project, which is going to spawn a very complex structure, but it does help to address some of the risks downstream by explicitly tying those back to initial steps in the project management process. Another approach to this is to view this as a program rather than one large project. That's something I feel like is kind of growing in popularity among clients, to view fleet electrification as a journey, as a program where there's a series of projects that all are contributing value and capability in line with those kind of overall objectives of the organization to electrify vehicles, reduce emissions, and gain additional capability and functionality of those electric vehicles. That's something that kind of depends on the size of your fleet and how many vehicles you're trying to consider for electrification. In cases where I have clients that have thousands of vehicles, that programmatic approach to fleet electrification and a series of projects within that portfolio of that program makes sense. But if you're a smaller business and you have a handful of vehicles, a kind of a bit more comprehensive project is something that fits there as well. There's also the standpoint of approaching this as kind of a sequential waterfall of tasks that have dependencies over time. That fits well into developing infrastructure, assessing vehicles, making purchases of new vehicles, deploying them. But then once you get down towards the end of this, if you're taking a more programmatic approach, then there's opportunities for more agile project management in terms of optimizing the fleet of electric vehicles and their routes that they drive, strategies for charging and maintaining those vehicles. There's a lot more opportunities there for incremental improvement, which then kind of lends itself to a more agile approach. So, there's definitely across the whole spectrum of fleet electrification opportunities to pull out, every trick in your bag of tools as a project manager to make use of, different approaches to project management to fit the needs and the requirements of each of those tasks along the way. So there's definitely a lot in it for project managers. And, compared to all the things that a company does, if you're going to take on something like fleet electrification, having really good, strong project managers that are well versed in all the different approaches to project management is of critical importance. So kind of now to start out with just some of the challenges around fleet electrification. Obviously, some of the things that are, right at the top line of the news is around supply chain issues more recently. That's something to keep in mind as you're, approaching a fleet electrification project. It's just making sure that you understand, what the limitations are for, the vehicles that you may be trying to procure or pieces of critical equipment for charging infrastructure that may have a substantial impact on the timeline of your project or eligibility for incentives and subsidies from government agencies that are trying to kind of encourage certain types of behavior for purchasing electric vehicles or how the vehicles are charged and operated. Those are definitely part of it. One thing else to consider here on the financial side is that, as with a lot of procurement right now, you're faced with the implications of inflation and rapidly changing prices. Electric vehicles and the charging equipment, you're dealing with equipment that's quite heavily dependent upon the cost of the commodities that go into those components. So a lot of the components for batteries, looking at the prices of lithium and other critical minerals, the cost of those minerals is something that then gets passed on to the consumer fairly quickly, and is definitely something to keep in mind that as you're going through the budgeting aspect of an electrification project, what you think the costs are today may be substantially different from where those costs are going to be in the future. That's something we've seen that over time as things change, both increasing costs, but then also we've seen decreasing costs as technologies become more efficient and kind of get more for your money based off of the improvements in the underlying technology of electric vehicles. So there is variance in both directions to consider. One thing else then, when it comes to the operational side of things, is to consider, how the vehicles are going to fit into, the way, an electric vehicle might operate differently than that of existing internal combustion engine vehicle in the fleet, whether that's driving distances or kind of the technology that's part of an electric vehicle that might enable things like self-driving, driver assistance. but then also just the constraints on the range of those vehicles and how that fits into the way they're operated. We've also worked with clients where you're considering, the resiliency of your electric supply. And so in some cases, if you have a fleet of vehicles and they need to be available, at a very high rate of availability, then putting in backup generation on site or battery storage on site, other things to kind of further ensure the availability of those vehicles to be charged and available when they're needed. Additionally, this is a point where if you're looking at like medium and heavy duty vehicles, when working with automakers that are in the process of announcing new vehicles, and that's something that a 2-3 years down the road, you may see a range of different vehicles that have capabilities that might be a fit for specific operational capabilities. One example would be like garbage trucks or refuse trucks. That's something that is becoming increasingly popular to electrify those vehicles. And that's something that is a consideration for sure when it comes to assessing the fleet of vehicles. Moving on here into the infrastructure side of things, though, that's something that also may be a little bit different for a company that has typically had internal combustion engine vehicles. There's not as much of the investment in infrastructure needed for historically internal combustion engine vehicles that can be fueled with liquid fuels that can be tanked in, or the vehicles can just go to a nearby petrol station and fill up with fuel. That's something to consider, the availability of power on the electric grid, working with utilities fairly closely to understand kind of what capabilities they have, what the increased needs are for the load to serve those vehicles, and then also understanding kind of what is the technology being used to charge those vehicles. At what level of power is being what rate of charge is going to be used to service those vehicles. That's something that's going to have a substantial impact on the need for additional infrastructure for the utility. And so that's a new stakeholder in the process for managing a fleet of vehicles, is engaging with the electric utilities to make sure that you have sufficient infrastructure there to serve those vehicles. And kind of the final thing here on the infrastructure side is that some of the emerging technologies for vehicle charging includes vehicle to grid or vehicle to building, vehicle to load technology, so two-way charging capabilities. That's something else that starts to open up a whole range of other capabilities, use cases for those vehicles. And that's something to keep in mind as well, because it's not just being a vehicle at that point. Now you have something that can provide backup power for facilities, can provide value back to the utility for managing peak demands, and also could potentially unlock a stream of value if utilities are providing incentives or payments for that load that would be sent back to the grid from the vehicles. So that starts to kind of unlock a whole range of other capabilities, other things to consider for those vehicles. So kind of starting out though with the fleet electrification journey, I feel like it's easy to kind of jump into some of the more nuanced, more technical things, but it's also important to have kind of your quick elevator pitch to explain why you're going through the electrification process and answering just really simple questions about the electric vehicle infrastructure and the vehicles that you would be electrifying. And so answering questions around kind of where are they going to be charged? Where is the infrastructure for those vehicles? And what the implications are of having infrastructure in those locations, and how that affects the operations of the business. Then also understanding kind of how are they going to be used? Are you going to just change the vehicle out? It's going to be an electric vehicle instead of internal combustion engine vehicle. Is it going to be used just as it was? Or is there something that you're going to make use of the battery in that vehicle to provide backup, a backup source of electricity for your facilities, or trying to make use of them in other ways. And then finally, kind of when are they being charged, or when are vehicles available? So if you have a fleet of vehicles and they're going to be out on a route doing deliveries, for example, during the day, or they're out, you have an 8-hour shift where that vehicle is away from the depot, and then it's back for in the evening at night, or if you're running a business that has 24-hour operations and those vehicles are kind of constantly being swapped out from one shift to the next, then that's going to make a bit of a difference in terms of the underlying technology, possibly the need for faster charging, but also understanding kind of, are they going to be charged during kind of off-peak times for the grid, for the electric utilities consideration, and also just how much is that energy going to cost during those times. So those are kind of like just high level, kind of more simplistic questions around kind of the where, how, and when you would use an electric vehicle and what that means for the business. So when it comes down to where to start for an electric vehicle project and kind of a fleet electrification process, kind of really having a clear business case that explains sort of why we're doing what we're doing, what are the benefits of it, what are the objectives, how are we going to get to that point, and sort of why we're doing what we're going to do is really important. That's something as a project manager, if you're doing something that hasn't been done before, kind of starting to change something out that's been a kind of well-established process within a business, like having an internal combustion engine vehicle and then changing it to an electric vehicle, you're going to get a lot of questions from people, and they're going to want to know, well, why are we doing this? Like, what's the benefit? Like, why is this going to make our business run more efficiently? What's in it for us? Like, those are kind of some of the big questions that people get, and having a business case and having the analysis that's behind that is an important part to kind of get things going. Kind of some of the key things that go into that initial kind of planning and development of a business case. A lot of it's kind of the financial analysis, the cost of ownership, cost of possibly leasing vehicles versus owning vehicles. That starts to kind of, address the question of like, is this financially a good idea for the business? In some cases, there may be other motivations around kind of environmental objectives of the company. That's a whole nother thing to include into that equation. But usually starting out with the kind of cost of ownership, knowing financially what the impact is on the business for considering electric vehicles is kind of a key place to start. That's typically where a lot of companies start with their analysis to begin an electric vehicle project. Then going through and considering your local regulatory policies is an important part of it as well. There's usually some kind of tax incentive or financial incentive for electrifying vehicles. But then there's also things around permitting and the approval process of getting infrastructure developed for electric vehicle charging. That's something that's very critical to consider for the timeline of the project. Work in places where the jurisdictions that we're talking about have relatively slow development processes. They may not have the capability to go through and quickly approve a development plan, and that may, cause delays in that project timeline. And so that's something that, excuse me, is a pretty important thing to consider. Kind of how the engagement interfacing with government agencies is going to affect the project itself. Excuse me. And then kind of moving from kind of that interaction with government agencies into kind of the operations of the business, operational preparedness for electric vehicles. And so that's getting into planning for how the vehicles are going to be charged and how the vehicles will be operated within the fleet. Excuse me, seasonal allergies are getting the best of me today. And then kind of moving from that into understanding the availability of infrastructure. This is something where typically you'll have a series of meetings with the local utility, go through what's available in the distribution system, give them a list of the sites and locations that we're considering for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and then figuring out kind of what the make ready process is for the utility to serve those loads. And so that's definitely a couple of the key things to consider up front. And then finally, as we're talking a little bit about the cost of ownership, there is an allocation of additional capital or of money to fund these types of programs, and understanding kind of what are the expectations for a return on that investment. If you're talking to like a chief financial officer, they'll have some expectations on kind of what the return is on money compared to other opportunities within the business to invest in, and making sure that you have a clear understanding of what those requirements are going to be. So kind of once you've kind of gathered that stuff up front, then kind of moving into all of the aspects of both strategy, energy utilities, and operations, then moving that into the development of your business case, which essentially tells you what you want to do, why you want to do it, and roughly how you're going to go about doing that. So I see in the chat here, there's a question about supply chain. That's definitely something that comes up quite a bit here, at the upfront process, excuse me, of kind of developing your plan for electrification. That's something that, first of all, kind of building in contingencies into your timeline is kind of the first step in terms of addressing that for the supply chain. The second thing is, if you can buy things in bulk, sometimes that may be trying to find other partners or other businesses that are going through a similar process, trying to pool together to purchase things in bulk in large quantities. That's something that will get you moved, to the front of the line for suppliers. And then just in general, trying to place orders as soon as you know what you need, and trying to get that process started as quickly as possible. It's something that the companies, the suppliers of equipment, they obviously want to be able to provide the equipment to their customers and make money based off of that. So they're trying to get equipment out as fast as they can. So it's really trying to collaborate with them, figure out what you can do to fit within the constraints that they have as manufacturer and supplier of equipment. Having that kind of upfront conversation with them. Sometimes it could end up being, switching to a different piece of equipment that may not have a part that is potentially going to be more difficult for them to procure. Just in general, being flexible in terms of supply chain side of it is definitely kind of the best approach to try to mitigate those issues around supply chain. And so just in general here, we've gone through and we're talking to companies around the development of a strategy and development of their fleet electrification journey. Put together kind of a bit of a longer curve here to show kind of some of the different steps along the way. That's part of the journey to ultimately electrifying some of their vehicles. Some of the key things here I kind of want to highlight in this is that there are key decision points, kind of go, no go stage gates, within this process, especially after, plans have been developed or after the initial deployment of electric vehicles. Kind of when you get down to the point of determining whether you're going to scale up your electric vehicle fleet or possibly press pause on the process, wait for some new technologies to come out that might, address some of the issues or concerns that you might have based on the experience with some of the first few vehicles. Or you might realize that it's a great thing and that what you've done works really well, has a great payback, and that you want to go full speed ahead and scale up as quickly as possible. So that's definitely something to kind of keep in this process, especially when you're talking to senior management at a company. Um, having these kind of safety points in here in terms of saying like, hey, we're not just gonna like run off here and we're gonna go do a bunch of stuff and change a bunch of vehicles out and just keep running through that. We're gonna have key places here where you're gonna have well-established governance processes to make sure that there are sign-offs and approvals of um, of the plans that have been developed as part of this project or program, and make sure everyone's comfortable with it before you start moving forward and making those changes and implementing those processes. And I see another question here in the chat. Kind of the biggest roadblocks to EVs in the US and Europe. I think, number one is availability of vehicles. I have a client that we're working with that has put us well over 10,000 vehicles. They want to do a full fleet electrification. And we're going through and they have different types of vehicles. Some of the vehicles are light duty trucks, and went through and realized that hey, this is really going to make a lot of sense. We really want to do this. They went to an automaker and said, hey, we want to buy several hundred light duty electric trucks. And the automaker went back to them and said, this is awesome. We love it. We can give you 2 vehicles in 2 years. Get in line with everyone else. And that was one of the big roadblocks there. It's just the availability of vehicles that aren't a light duty passenger vehicle. So that's definitely one of the roadblocks. There's far more demand for electric vehicles than there is supply of electric vehicles right now, especially in North America. I think in Europe you have the same thing in terms of just there's a lot of demand for those vehicles, especially at a fleet level. You're making a large purchase of those vehicles, and that's something that can be a bit of a challenge because the automakers are then trying to balance between both selling to consumers, but then also selling to fleets as well. Sometimes they want to sell to consumers because of the margins that they make on those vehicles relative to a fleet owner. And so that's definitely one part of it. The other part is just availability of public charging. That's something that in the U.S. there's a National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Plan that was just started back at the beginning of the year. I've been personally working on the development of some of the plans for the states that we're working with in that area. So that's going to be level 3 fast charging, DC fast charging on highways and corridors, and providing kind of that public infrastructure for fast charging of electric vehicles. That's definitely been one of the gaps. There hasn't been a lot of demand yet. It's sort of a chicken or the egg thing where, it's like if I build chargers, then maybe there'll be some demand for charging, but I don't know if there's any demand for this charging yet. So maybe I'm not going to build the chargers up yet. So that's been one of the challenges there. Big government subsidies there to do that. I think it's $7.5 billion for the U.S. Granted, a much more vast area than a lot of the European countries in terms of just the length of roads, the amount of just physical area that has to be covered for electric vehicle infrastructure. And so that's definitely something that is definitely part of it. You've also got, I know within Europe, there's been some very healthy tax incentives and credits for electric vehicle purchases. That's something I think the US is trying to kind of copy some of those things as well, increasing the incentives, trying to target the incentives for vehicles. So that way that they're not an incentive going to like a luxury vehicle that could be an electric vehicle, and kind of more to consumers that you're really trying to change their purchasing decision by giving them an incentive. And so that's definitely been part of that. In terms of kind of government incentives around fleets in particular, I'm not aware of programs that are specifically for fleets. A lot of them, the incentives that apply to individual consumer vehicles are also eligible for fleet vehicles. And so that's something that there isn't much distinction between those. And so, when you're doing things at scale for fleets, those incentives also become pretty attractive to those businesses. And so just kind of back to this process here, this is kind of at a fairly high level. If I were to go through, this whole process here, I have about 300 slides that go through each of these steps, and there's actually subtasks within each of these steps, and there's additional processes that need to be considered. And so there's a whole lot of information that goes into kind of developing and building out each of these levels of the fleet electrification journey. But for right now,
Brian, just a question. There is a question related to the same topic. A question is, are you aware of any government funding to encourage companies planning to move to electric EV fleets, particularly for company cars?
I mean, in terms of targeting at companies, there are more incentives around medium and heavy duty vehicles that are more kind of targeted to that business sector. When it comes to company cars in particular, those are passenger cars, and in a lot of cases, there's not much of a distinction between a consumer buying that vehicle and a business buying that vehicle. They're generally all eligible for equivalent tax incentives as a incentive to the purchase of those vehicles.
Thanks, Brian. Maybe associated question. What do you see as the biggest roadblocks to EVs in USA and in Europe?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the roadblocks, it's obviously availability of the vehicles and availability from the automakers, just having enough of the vehicles available because there's such a high demand for them. And then also for just the locations of the charging, especially if you get into areas where there's long distances, more rural areas, availability of charging in those areas is definitely a bit of a challenge. You also have a lot of charging that has been built out as a level 2 charger. So for a vehicle to charge up, it may take 7 or 8 hours for the vehicle to charge up completely. And that doesn't really fit in well for vehicles that are en route. If you're going on a trip, you don't want to have to stop and use a level 2 charger because that's going to be quite a bit of time, unless you're using the charger at a hotel or wherever you're staying and the vehicle can charge overnight. That's definitely kind of some of the barriers that has sort of been a roadblock for EV adoption.
Thanks, Brian.
And so just to kind of go through here on, I'll go through the first 3 stages here to give a bit of a flavor of some of the things that are challenges along the way, for each of these tasks or each of these stages. That is, when you're getting into the assessment stage, obviously this is really heavy into data analysis. There's a lot of financial analysis. There's analysis of how vehicles are driving. So there's additional telematic equipment that can be plugged into vehicles, and that gathers information about how the vehicle is being driven, where it goes, how much energy is being consumed, like how much fuel is being consumed, driving patterns, all of that kind of stuff, both for the existing vehicles, so internal combustion engine vehicles, you can gather that information from them. But then also once you're considering switching into an electric vehicle, being able to understand what the assumptions are around how the vehicles are going to be used, that has a pretty substantial impact on the cost of ownership and how those vehicles are going to be managed. Obviously, there's a pretty substantial upfront cost of an electric vehicle. When you go through and doing the cost of ownership analysis for vehicles, when you look at the full life cycle of an electric vehicle, they typically right now are either break even or saving money. Especially when you consider the cost of petrol in Europe, they're cost effective to switch to an electric vehicle. They may not be cost effective in the first year because you're going to have to go in and make that substantial upfront investment in electric vehicle charging equipment if you decide to charge your vehicles on site, or you have to figure out a way to use public chargers to fill those needs. So that's definitely one of the bit of a roadblock to EV adoption. There's also some of the things around just kind of what you don't know going into having an electric vehicle. There's a lot of uncertainty then around exactly, well, I think I know how I might use this vehicle, but am I completely sure about how I'm going to use this vehicle? Or have some estimates of what the costs are going to be, but are my limited maintenance costs for an electric vehicle relative to the internal combustion engine vehicle, is that actually going to materialize? There's all that kind of uncertainty to it that once you go through and have adopted a few electric vehicles, then you might have a lot better information about that. And that's part of the reason why the electric vehicle adoption, vehicle electrification, is generally approached as kind of the initial part of a fleet gets electrified, a few chargers get developed, a few vehicles get electrified, and then you improve all of your assumptions. A lot of this information that went into this assessment gets improved. And it's sort of like a loop where you're cycling that information back in to improve your decision-making process. There's also, a lot of things that have been changing from a regulatory standpoint, government policies. That's something that if you were considering electrifying a vehicle just a couple years ago, things would look a lot different than they look today. And I'm pretty confident that in a year from now, 2 years from now, things will look even different than they are right now. And so that's definitely something that comes into play for trying to figure out the electrification process. Ultimately in this, though, the assessment, you're really just trying to kind of understand what the uncertainty is and kind of the variability in what can happen for electrifying a fleet, and then trying to quantify what that uncertainty really is. To the extent knowing kind of like, here's my base case, but what's my best case, what's my worst case for what could happen with these vehicles in terms of the cost of electricity, how the vehicles are being run, what the maintenance is going to be, all of those things. So factoring that in kind of gives you at least some bumper rails here to kind of like understand if things go really good or really bad, what's that range of outcome? Even if things did go bad, is that an acceptable thing, or do we need to take some steps to mitigate that downside risk of cost of energy or other things that that may affect the decisions to electrify your fleet? And so moving into the second stage here, this is really where things start to get to be a bit more tactical following that initial strategic analysis. So this is when you're trying to figure out exactly which building am I going to put the charger on? What are the policies that need to be put in place for employees that may be driving a vehicle home? Am I going to pay for their charger? How do I pay for the power that they're paying for their home that then is going into their fleet vehicle, their company car? Understanding just kind of during the process of actually implementing the EV charging infrastructure, there's going to be some disruptions. There's going to be construction that's going to be happening. Things may fall behind schedule. You may have a supply chain issue that prevents some of the equipment from arriving on time, and kind of understanding what that variability is. So those are things like having contingency plans for keeping your internal combustion engine vehicles until everything is deployed and up and running, maybe keeping them in parallel if you have the space for the vehicles. Those are definitely some of the issues to consider. And then also just making sure that you have the right people to do the installations of equipment. You need to have an electrician. Having a really good electrician is very important for EV charging equipment. Not every electrician is going to be qualified and experienced with electric vehicle charging equipment. Depending on where you are, there may be a local trade school that provides additional training to electricians, maybe provides them with certification for electric vehicle charging equipment. If you can find an electrician that has that additional certification, that has experience with it, those are the electricians to work with. That will save you a whole lot of headaches down the road because they're not going to be trying to figure it out, while you're paying them on your project. And so that's definitely one of the very critical things to think about. Obviously, you mentioned about supply chain stuff. There's definitely kind of highly variable amounts of inventory. Especially if you're running a large fleet and you're talking about needing to purchase 10, 20, 50, 100 chargers, that's going to have pretty substantial impact on the inventory that's available. Just in the case of one of the automakers that I know that could only provide a company with 2 electric trucks when they wanted hundreds of them, you may need 100 chargers, but they may only be able to give you 10, and that may be just how they can address your initial need, but just say, hey, work with us down the road, we'll get to where we need to be in terms of the amount of quantity for electric vehicle chargers. So those are definitely kind of some of the key things here. This is also where you need to work with your legal team as well, because you're going to start to think about, like, what are the contracts that I need to enter into? Am I going to have a managed service provider that's going to manage the electric vehicle chargers for us? Okay, what's the service level agreement on that? What's the penalty if that charger is not available? Because if that charger is not available and I'm depending on it for my fleet to run, then I better be made whole. I may better have some clause in there that will have them bring me some other form of charging, backup generator in the case of something being failed, a certain number of hours that they have to fix something that goes down, it's not functioning, or providing some level of assurance on top of that. So that's definitely a very key part here as well that often gets overlooked, is that working closely with your legal and contracts group within your organizations is definitely a very key thing to do to help mitigate some of those risks to your organization as a result of some of the new infrastructure that would be critical to your operation of your fleet. And finally, here is sort of kind of getting into the deployment phase. This is kind of could be either the initial phase as you're going through and doing your initial rollout, or also as you get into the scale up and further deployment. Stage 3, stage 4, the whole project. Obviously, this is where you're getting into tight timelines, trying to make sure that things get done in the right order. Having things done from the utilities to enable the charging infrastructure, having your electric vehicles show up in the right order and the time that you want them is definitely important. But then also going through and figuring out a training program for your employees, making sure that they're trained and aware of how to operate those vehicles, and make sure they're aware of how vehicles should be properly charged and maintained. That's definitely a big part of it. If you have a union workforce, making sure that all the steps that you're taking are compliance with union rules and that they're in alignment with the electrification of your vehicles. And then also just setting up the protocols to make sure you have visibility into what the costs are of the vehicles. I have clients that, if you're in an industrial or commercial business, you may have a electric utility pricing structure or tariff that you're on that is based off of the peak demand of your facility. Well, if you bring in a EV charger, if that EV charger is being used coincident with all the other electric loads within your facility, then you may end up being hit with a higher charging cost than if you knew how to kind of make those two things not coincident with one another. And so those are definitely things to consider, and having some mechanisms just to be able to kind of more closely monitor what those costs are is definitely important. Another thing here also is, as you're trying to think about where the EVs are going to be driving, there's been some pretty good developments more recently in terms of routing electric vehicles, making sure that you have a route that's more friendly to an electric vehicle. So if you need to stop for charging, I know Google Maps, if you plug in, you can now say you're driving an electric vehicle, and they'll route you, in a way where you can stop and charge for your vehicle. Make sure you're not veering too far away from chargers if if you need to have a route that's more friendly for that. And then also, if you're going through and just electrifying part of your fleet, then now you have two types of vehicles that you're operating, both internal combustion and electric vehicles. So you're having a much greater amount of infrastructure that has to be maintained during that timeline. So working closely with the maintenance and operations teams to make sure that they're implementing the processes to make sure that they're maintaining a more diverse set of vehicles, and that all of that is covered as part of your deployment process. And then also, there's definitely some evolution in the fleet management tool, availability. They're getting much more sophisticated fairly quickly, but they are still fairly primitive relative to where they are going to be in the future. And so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Like, you may not get every feature that you might want for the software and the solutions that are going to help you, manage an electric vehicle fleet. So kind of, managing expectations is definitely pretty key here at this point. Electric vehicles can be great, but also they may not meet all the expectations based off of kind of the hype that might be coming out from some of the automakers. And so just making sure that you're fairly clear in terms of exactly like what you're going to get and how that's going to kind of align with the expectations of your employees. And kind of final point here on this is that when you're approaching electric vehicles and kind of e-mobility in general, if you're electrifying your own fleet, you're the customer and you're kind of at the center of this broad ecosystem that affects electric mobility. And this is a bit of a different ecosystem than if you're just getting a internal combustion engine vehicle, and it's definitely got a lot of different players within that ecosystem. And there's not a single entity that's going to step in and be able to address everything, from beginning to end for the electric mobility ecosystem. And that's something that just keeping in mind that depending on who you're working with, what you're trying to get done, there are going to be a lot of dependencies to map out and make sure that those are all being addressed, and that you're managing that process to understand, okay, if I'm trying to build something out, who do I need to engage with? Who do I need to have that conversation with? And that's definitely been kind of one of the most effective tactics that I've found, is just having conversations with people and talking to them about what you're trying to accomplish, see where they're at, kind of understand like what their perspective is. They may be new to this whole process as well. And, you may learn alongside with them, or they may share a piece of information, some knowledge, because they've been through it once before, or you may have already gone a step or two down the road ahead of them, and you can get them to catch up along with you. And so it's really it's an ecosystem, but it's also a community of people that kind of all have, little bits of kind of this overall puzzle that they're putting together around electric mobility. And, working together with everyone, along that journey is definitely an important thing to consider. But with that was my last slide here. I think maybe there'll be some questions here in the chat.
Yeah, sure, Marco. Maybe you can take up the question and then we'll come back to this one. You can. Yeah, so we'll go back to the previous slide, please. Yeah, sure. We'll take up the question. Just let us finish these national awards. I would like to welcome the Vice President of Ireland chapter of PMI, Mr. Peter Glynn, to present the national award slide, please.
Thank you, Santosh. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you, Brian. That was very informative, and I very much enjoyed that presentation. A big thank you. I just wanted to take a minute or two out to share with you the information about the Ireland chapter awards this year. So we are very excited about the awards, particularly when we're looking at the 5 categories that you see on the screen in front of you. So I'd like to encourage you to really think very strongly about submitting for one of these categories. Now, we've just extended the deadline out to next Monday, and I think it's fair to say that none of the categories are particularly onerous for the submission. Yes, you have to submit information, and they average about 2,000 words each. But I would highly encourage you to really seriously consider submitting for one of these categories. So, for example, we have Project Professional of the Year. We have Project Management for Social Good. We have our Private Sector Project of the Year. We have our Public Sector Project of the Year. And then we have the PMO of the Year. And we also have a special category this year for the greatest national impact project. And this is open for public nomination. So you can nominate any project that you feel is worthy of that title. And that will be going out to a public vote in the month of October. And then we're actually really excited about our Black Tie Awards dinner, which has been held in November in PwC in Dublin. That's on November 24th. And that will be a really great celebration of all of our finalists and the award winners on the night. And we are really, really looking forward to it. So again, I just like to emphasize that it's open to absolutely anybody who wants to nominate. You don't have to be a member of PMI, and there's no cost involved in making a submission. So I think you've got 4 days left, and I would highly encourage you to consider submitting for one of our 6 categories. Thank you very much, and I'm now going to hand you over on to Mary.
Sure. Just Peter, thanks a lot for the introduction. It was really interesting to participate in the national awards. Just before going to the PDU slide, right? Let us take a couple of questions which are coming on the screen. Yeah. Brian, the question is coming from Mark Gannon. Have the incentives been developed in USA yet to facilitate two-way charging?
Yes, yeah, actually, there have been several pilot programs and some of the utilities in the U.S. that have been developed around two-way charging. I'm aware there's a couple of them. There's one that was in Colorado. There's a couple in the Northeast U.S. around two-way charging with Nissan Leaf, vehicles. Those are kind of an extension of demand management programs from utilities. So there's demand management, demand response programs. For helping a facility manage their peak demands on the system during peak hours for the power grid, and the utilities then providing incentives for those vehicles to provide power back to the grid. In those cases, the value of that to the grid, given that it's a dispatchable resource to the utility, is pretty substantial. You're talking about thousands of dollars a year per vehicle for those incentives, for those programs. And so you can essentially pay for a vehicle just from those programs alone in those cases. So those have been highly successful, and I expect to see a lot more of those being developed.
Thanks, Brian. The next question is coming from Sam Foley. Hi, Brian. Thanks so much for the presentation. Very informative. Do you see challenges in balancing timing the purchase of fleet with the development of infrastructure and availability of electricity supply? Are the fleets and the associated infrastructure commonly combined into single projects or programs?
So I mean, just in terms of how that stuff's all approached, I would say more often it's approached as a program. I mean, fine distinction between programs and just a really big project. But in terms of kind of the infrastructure build out versus vehicles versus customer like employee training and operations, those can be separate projects within that broader program, especially when you're getting into the incremental development of infrastructure for utilities for electric supply. Obviously, the timelines for those can be substantially varied based on the availability of the equipment. Worked with cases where there's plenty of power available at the site because it's a commercial customer that has plenty of additional capacity, or they may have already been able to allocate some of their own capacity to serve their vehicles. And so that sort of short circuits that part of that process if there's enough available capacity on the grid. But then in terms of procuring the electric vehicle chargers and procuring the vehicles, those kind of come down to how you want to approach it. If there's available public charging that might meet the needs of that fleet, then if you can go ahead and buy the vehicles, you might have to go use public charging for a period of time, and then can switch over to your own charging. That's going to have an impact on the cost of operating the fleet, and there's definitely some kind of operational challenges for that you might want to kind of keep in mind. But it's really something that you kind of have to be flexible and figure out what works best for your business. But there's definitely constraints that need to be considered across those things.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Mary, over to you now.
Okay, thank you very much. And we're right to the wire here, so I'll be fast on this. The Ireland chapter of PMI supports professional development of our members. For attending the webinar this evening, you will earn 1 business PDU. The PDU claim code is there, C144T084XS. If you are a member of the Ireland chapter of the PMI, we will auto register the PDU for you when you attend this live webinar. You can also self-claim the PDUs using the claim code as above. Okay, and if you are watching the recording, you can self-register for the PDU on that link there. It leaves me as I said, we're right to the wire. So Brian, I want to thank you very much for a fantastically informative presentation here this evening on eMobility. It was really, really fantastic. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended, and we hope to see you all soon again at our next event.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.